we just jump into the section number 1, the non-human section?
So that means you want to go non-human, is that right?
We want to go non-human.
Yeah. There we go.
Perfect.
Yeah. So, Barbara, do you know about eyebrow lice?
No.
They're like tiny, and they live in the eyebrows of most people. During the day, they hide in the hair follicles, where with a good microscope you can see the little antennas sticking out. But at night, they come out and like walk over your face, where they eat and meet and have sex before they retreat back into your eyebrows again to sleep and attend to their offspring. So very close to and on and all around the human eye, this metaphor instrument of human vision, live other beings.
Well, I think that speaks so well to the fact that we are not individuals. I mean, I didn't know about eyebrow lice, but I love this story, and we're really walking collaborations between different entities.
Yeah, and these terms like non-human, I guess they all like try to come to terms with the fact that we never really have been human in the first place, that we are kind of deeply interconnected with other than human life forms and with non-living matters, machines, and infrastructures, as well as biochemical processes. And all of this is shaping us and the planet, really.
Yeah, I think that gave us kind of a first idea of what this first section will be all about. We will start now with a movement lecture by Alexandra Piric, which is exploring future ground. And her video lecture, oh, wow, that's nice. No, the other direction, there you go. No, there. Anyway.
Get it.
And after her video lecture, we will have our first live panel discussion.
So a quick reminder again, I will join the first Q&A of the panel discussion to pass questions from our Telegram group to the panelists. So do join the Telegram group if you want to join the discussion, and do ask questions throughout the panel. We'll do our best to keep an eye out for your input. And Moritz?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Don't mind me.
Yeah. Okay, never mind Moritz. We will do our best to keep an eye out for your input and represent you in the session. So Moritz, could you take us to future ground?
Poetry is part of any revolution. An estrangement from things as usual. Instead of being exhausted by the metaphor of the blizzard, as futurists loved to imagine. Conjunctures that make change graspable and possible are matters of sustained efforts and complete transformations of subjectivity. It is these that build trade unions, cooperatives, institutions for and of a different culture. And new education practices. Then what grows out of the different seeds planted by these conjunctures is that which is best nurtured and allowed to grow. Alongside dreams of industrial development, fire and speed, we might remember Isadora Duncan opening a dance school in Moscow in 1921. which attempted to feed its students from its own collectively grown garden. Progress and evolution are still being articulated through language and visual metaphors, by excessive use of straight lines, of words like up, forward, fast, the erectile upwards explosion of rockets and skyscrapers. If only form wouldn't align with function for this masculinist dream of speed, verticality, and combustion as pleasure. When we know that pleasure is in fact a matter of sensibility and attention to each other and to rhythm. According to the dictionary, downshifting means living a simpler life. Oh, the lost arts of attention, the excitement and complexity of living the life of a financial advisor. And how does slowing down sound in the world where speed and growth have intrinsically positive connotations? Green, sustainable businesses still have to remain competitive. Stock market graphs showing downward moving lines are the most feared. The economy is going to hell instead of going to heaven. What should we do with spirals, though, where moving backwards is actually moving forward? Let's say we do not need to slow down. We need to take time. To demand time and take it. if not receive. To refuse not to have it. There's pleasure in taking time. Some climbing plants move up to 3 inches per day. As philosopher of science Paco Calvo says, that is a lot. 3 inches is a lot. It just depends what you want to do. How should we spend our time once we are nourished? Or why shouldn't we even enjoy today, spending time growing and appreciating that which nourishes us? Walking through the forest requires that one pays attention to multiple things in multiple directions. You can't just look ahead. The topography always changes, even subtly. You need to watch, feel where you put your step. There's no flat ground. Movement here cannot be standardized or automated. The road is not cleared for smooth locomotion and transportation. Looking up, feeling up, moving up. Combines with looking, feeling, moving down, around, up close, further away. Planetary sounds like a most important word, courageously grappling with the scale of the problems today. Why bother with anything less, under, lower down? Why pay attention to a multiplicity of scales, as Anat Singh invites us to do? Maybe because there is no such thing as a standard, single one. Combining words is maybe not the best solution for language, but for a start, uttering these connected sounds might help relation. Thinking things together rather than, again, cramming them into overarching concepts and categories that might describe more of one's own sense of importance than the reality of the world. And what exactly is important, and for whom? I'd like to learn to think, move, like in a forest. One that has not been industrially planted and has no large open path cut through it. An environment that is not easily predictable, in which we can still train to observe and move as humans, as human animals. And with the help of multi-sensory integration afforded by embodiment, which is not the same with processing different streams of data, which is not the same with interpreting abstract information while always seated in an ergonomic chair in front of a screen. Different movement is different knowledge and different becoming. Always moving in straight lines on flat land is thinking becoming the same way. Even here in Domogled, where Romanian authorities make the least effort to regulate anything. Forest rangers tell you not to go off path. You might get lost, get bitten by vipers, and you also disturb local flora. Your steps, the pressure your body applies on the ground, the sounds it makes, they can all erode soil, destroy ecosystems. With how much care and attention, then, should we step in the world so that we are still able to respond to and grapple with the non-designed effects of our actions? How do we become other than the human ball in the world china shop? At what scales should we think about our steps? If you pay attention to plant life when walking through the forest, your walking changes. You spend more time walking. You spend time and take time to move alongside everything that moves, thinks, feels around you. At different speed and at different scales. But pleasure is a matter of sensitivity to each other and to rhythm. What the camera sees is not what I feel. Recording is always partial, as any experience. And happiness, a meaningful moment, is always also about an excess. Something that is impossible to contain and translate. Like trying to capture a beautiful sunset on camera. You trade off the fleeting feeling of wonder for the kitsch postcard promise of permanence. Not everything needs to be captured or exteriorized into an artifact or onto a different support. At least not before most of us actually manage to gather some knowledge to exteriorize. And what kind of knowledge? Define in which way? And gathered with which sensibility should we exteriorize today into our tools and technology? And for what purpose? And how do we define what is human or humane so we know what we want to survive? The forest here surrounds a thermal bath resort now almost in ruin. I was reminded of this place by a video game, one that I actually used to play when I was a child. It was called Siberia. The character was a young American lady playing a detective that at some point would travel to a ruined seaside resort to solve a quest. The place was called Aralbad. I didn't get the reference then because I had no knowledge of the Aral Sea at that time or the ecological disaster brought about by the large geoengineering project that made it dry up. Because of pollution, the characters would wear face masks in the decaying comfort of Aralbad. They're reminded of us today. Dreams of control are hidden frustrations. Collaboration and humility are our best approaches and chances. Even as we desperately acknowledge, we might never learn how to do that, to step in, like in the forest. Poetry is not a rejection of reason, but its sophistication and expansion. Below the forest, large great buildings lay decrepit in the forgotten spa resort. Some are from former imperial times, when the Habsburgs came to spend time caring for themselves and marking their names on the walls of thermal spring caves. Others from communist times, when the Hercules brutalist complex was supposed to host and offer leisure time to thousands of workers, right near the old imperial bath. Then came laissez-faire capitalist transition and left them all to rot. Too big to be salvaged, administrated, or repurposed by community initiatives. And which community? Too unimportant because of their location and old body technologies for new power. The only large thing thriving amongst these ruins is an old sequoia tree.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here in front of the ZKM Kubus. I welcome you, everyone, you behind the screens following and participating since last night, and my dear panelists here. I want to welcome you to the first panel discussion of the Driving the Human Conference Festival. My name is Lena Reitschuster, and I have the honor moderating the panel on the non-human. And therefore, it is my duty to remind you once again of our good, nice, and good, really well-working Telegram chat. You are warmly invited to join this group. The link should be on the screen somewhere. Either like it's definitely on the website. So you can ask questions and comment on the discussion. We have reserved the last 10 minutes of this panel discussion for you. So Julian will zoom in and give the questions, is your voice, and is giving the questions so we can discuss and they can be answered. I have the pleasure now to welcome and introduce the panelists who share this virtual podium with me. First, I welcome Bogna Konyor. She's a writer and scholar and currently based in Shanghai. Hello, Bogna. Good to have you. A warm welcome also to Joanna Burke. She is a historian and a public intellectual and physically located in Greece right now. Hello, Joanna. And last but not least, I have the pleasure to introduce Kerry Wolf. He's a writer, editor, and professor who's located in Houston, Texas. Good morning, Kerry. This panel not only connects 4 different time zones, but brings together 3 great thinkers for the purpose of discussing nothing less than the urgencies of our time with regard to the human, non-human. I think we all agree on these urgencies, such as the climate crisis, growing economical difficulties, inequalities, the global pandemic we're in right now, rise of right-wing ideologies, and just to name a few. So because of the urgency, I want to jump in with the first question for Joanna, which is the last night during the opening of the festival, Peter Weibel said that we still have to become human. The ideas of the Enlightenment regarding the human are not yet reached. Would you agree that I know we is an awful unprecise term, but let's just work with it for now, are not yet human? And what does it mean to become human then?
Thanks, I'm really happy to be here. I think this goes really to the heart of what we're going to be debating in this panel, and indeed the whole conference. This concept of the human is, of course, an extremely volatile one. I mean, whatever period of history you want to look at, whatever culture you look at, there are, of course, these commonsensical definitions of who is the human and what is the animal. But what I find really interesting is that these are always being undermined, they're always contested, they're always being constructed and, of course, deconstructed. And I think it's not simply enough to say that there is this porous boundary between the human and the non-human or the animal, although, of course, there is. But I think more interesting is that the distinction is contested. The distinction is policed with this huge sort of precision. So in other words, the ideas, the values, the practices used to justify a particular understanding of the human over other forms of sentient life is what creates society and social life. And delimiting those territories not only involves violence, but inspires it. So this is always a becoming. And, if we look as far back as 1789, when the French Assembly's Declaration, the Rights of Man and Citizen, the first line, the first, article in that states that man is born free and remains free and equal. Okay, but of course, even then, it was absolutely not the case. I mean, that declaration excluded slaves, it excluded women, it excluded Jews, it excluded actors because they pretended to be something else. So I think that this, this need to always be aware that the human is always a becoming, but also to kind of disrupt this human-animal distinction. Becoming human is social labor, and that labor is always political. And that's, I think, what makes it so interesting for us to be discussing.
Thank you. But when we speak of the human, non-human, that means that we have two very like one very small, let's say, and one very big category. So like the human and the non-human. So Carrie, is the category non-human productive for addressing the urgencies we're facing right now, or the category human?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I agree with Joanna. My feeling's always been, and this is why I distinguish post-human from post-humanism as a philosophical orientation, because I think a lot of the aspirations of humanism are totally admirable and need to, maybe now more than ever, be pursued in earnest. I mean, certainly I think that's what we've seen recently politically. But, you know, my feeling has always been that we just need better philosophical tools to try to think the aspirations of the Enlightenment and think the aspirations of humanism than what we've inherited. And that shouldn't surprise anybody. I mean, time moves on. We have theoretical philosophical tools now that we didn't have 150, 250 years ago. So that project, I think Joanna's right, continues in earnest. I think one of the virtues of thinking about the non-human, especially now, is I think something everyone feels at the moment, at least I do, is this paradoxical situation where the world has never been more interconnected and more fragmented at the same time. Whether you think about ecology, whether you think about the phenomenon called globalization, whether you think about politics, whether you think about the increasing differentiation of human populations economically and in terms of precarity and exposure to climate change and so on. So I think, you know, to think about the non-human is to force you already to think about the paradoxical fact that, as my friend Donna Haraway puts it, not everything is connected, but everything is connected to something. So, and we see this, I mean, the perfect example, it's almost too good to be true if you're a post-humanist to think about the COVID pandemic in these terms. I mean, it's a perfect example of how you can't even begin to think about phenomena like immunity and autoimmunity, for example, which are central to biopolitical thought and biopolitical philosophy, as we know, without immediately beginning to think that paradox and to think in terms of complex systems. So for me, whether you're kind of interested in non-human creatures or not, whether you're interested in non-human life or not, one of the values of focusing our attention on the question of the human and or the non-human is that it forces us to sort of mobilize a new paradigm, I think, for thinking about not just transhumanism, not just post-humanism, but actually, as Joanna pointed out, the aspirations of humanism itself and how we can continue to have a more sophisticated account of how those can be justified, grounded, whatever term you would like.
Thank you. When speaking of connectedness, so that means that we have to some sort of re-acknowledge that we are like connected not to everything, but always to something. And how can we, as we talked about it earlier, like how can we be sensitive to these dependencies again? Let's say, Bogna, would you like to answer this question?
Sure. I think there's two ways in which we can address this problem of going beyond the human or revising the human. And the first is very much like Joanna and Carrie are describing, which is a project of revision of the Enlightenment attempt of the Enlightenment project that's happening mainly in Western European and American intellectual scene, but maybe it's not that relevant when it comes to other intellectual histories. For example, I live in China. Here, the philosophical tradition is very much different. So the questions that were posed by the Enlightenment are not exactly that much present here as they are in the environments where intellectually this question of post-humanism is being brought up. So in this case, this is a project of Western Enlightenment revising itself to be more ethical, more inclusive, in a way extending itself and its proposition somehow. On the other hand, there is the question of, this connectedness that you speak of. There's something happening here that we might take as a matter of the evolution of humanity, the technological and biological evolution of humanity that is actually happening irregardless of our intention of it happening. Over the last 100 years, we have built almost by accident a network of planetary technologies that are changing our economies, changing our biology, changing our society to an extent we can barely grasp the speed of. And that evolution that our species is implicated in ecologically and technologically is connecting us irregardless of what politics and ethics we try to devise. So we have here kind of clashing but intersecting projects of trying to get our bearing in a very changed situation and always kind of lacking and trying to perpetually catch up to what we have started as a species, but what is spinning out of control at the same time.
Do you think that we also have to develop a new form of ethics for this, or abandon it all along?
I think it's a difficult question. It is difficult to start questions about technological systems from the point of personal ethics and morality. They are very good for producing ideology. They are very good for politicians and priests to concern themselves with. But when it comes to species level thinking about complexity, I think we actually need to use non-human tools to think about non-human problems. So when we think about the development of machine learning or complex data processing systems that are able to think at a speed and scale beyond just human brains, perhaps we need to kind of implicate them in knowledge production process in order to grasp it. For an example, we can only know about climate change because we have very complex computer simulations of climate change. Otherwise, we would not have the knowledge of the ecological process that threatens our being as a species. We need computers to know about it and model it properly.
Thank you. I want to go back one more time to the notion of being connected and connectedness. I would like, let me check my questions. Yeah, I would like to ask Joanna what you wrote just recently, a book about human and animal relation concerning love, and using the concept of companion species of the before mentioned Donna Haraway in your publication. And do you see like to discuss these very specific relations human and animals have in the larger frame of like composing a new let's say demos, or like let's say a group that needs to be involved in policy making decisions?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely the case. I mean, one of the things when you start looking at human-animal relations is what Carrie referred to earlier, and that is that the language, in a sense, is not adequate for the complexity of what we're trying to deal with here. And in order to create a politics of love, a politics of connectedness, a politics of affection, trans species, I think we need to actually change the languages that we use to talk about these things. And one of the things that I have found particularly helpful in doing this is actually the concept of the Mobius strip. And it's a very simple concept, all you have to do is you just take a long piece of paper, you glue it together glue the two ends together, you twist it 180 degrees. And what this does, though, it creates a physical, a geographical even model whereby there is no inside outside, there is no hierarchies, there is no entrance point or exit point. And this gives us, I think, a way of talking about the differences between species without creating hierarchies, without using very unhelpful dichotomies such as biology inside, culture outside. And I think it's only by doing that that we can then think of, well, actually what we are doing when we're talking about interconnectedness is we're doing human political labor. That is, we are tying a knot in that Mobius strip, and we're saying there is where the human starts and the animal ends. And of course, that knot is like a slip knot. It moves around depending on culture, depending on historical factors and technologies and language and everything like that. And I think that by doing that, we can actually think more constructively about interconnectedness and the politics of interconnectedness.
Carrie, do you want to add something to that, or?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. In a way, the whole project of biopolitical thought, I think, has needed to be brought to that juncture in a way that the philosophical genealogy, the canonical philosophical genealogy of biopolitical thought has always been, it's kind of pretended to be interested in that question, but actually is not interested in non-human life in any serious way until recently, I think. So I think this is one of those examples of how something that we used to think was merely an ethical issue, actually through the lens of biopolitics, we can see as a biopolitical issue. And it's of a piece with how life, both human life and non-human life, are manipulated, explained, commodified, privatized, and so on, in ways that are distributed very unevenly across the planet, as we know, for which the species distinction, human and animal, I've argued, is actually not a constitutive distinction. That's kind of an old philosophical distinction that doesn't explain what's going on anymore. I did want to go back to Bogna's very interesting observation, which I think is right on, and it points to, I think, two crises that I tried to address in my the video that I recorded for you guys before the conference. I think she's absolutely right that non-human technologies, computer technology would be the paradigm, but there are many others we could point to. They're a part of our thinking at this point, whether we like it or not. I mean, but that's created under this kind of acceleration we've experienced. That's created the paradigmatic situation that we face right now, I think, at least in all the Western countries, but I would imagine it's true in China as well, which is the classic paradigm of kind of information overload, right? In which we have so much computing power and we have so much data that we can know things and think things that we couldn't know and think before, but it also creates a situation which a lot of sort of demagogues and ideological projects have taken advantage of to try to flatten what is in fact a very heterogeneous landscape of knowledge, in which I think disciplinarity actually then becomes more and more important. Disciplinary protocols become more and more important in that kind of landscape. But the second thing I want to point to that I think is even more important, that Bogna already gestured toward, this creates, I think, a crisis for our political institutions. These technological changes have so outrun the sort of philosophical foundations of our inherited political institutions, and they've outrun the evolutionary background of Homo sapiens as a species to really be able to live in that world, right? I mean, that's just, I think Homo sapiens is still a pretty primitive species, actually. So, if you take that asynchronicity with our political institutions and with our ability as a species to actually live in this, this mediascape in which time frames are shorter and shorter, screens are smaller and smaller, computing power is higher and higher. I think in a way that points to really one of the main crises of our situation right now is kind of dealing with those two asynchronicities. I'm glad Bogdan mentioned that. That's another way of another register in which to think about the term non-human outside of strictly biological or zoological register.
I can comment on
Yeah,
that,
please.
follow up on your question of interconnectedness and what Kari just said. We should not think in terms of ethical absolutes. So interconnectedness is not necessarily positive immediately as opposed to separatedness being negative. In fact, interconnectedness is our whole problem, right? The fact that every human economic action reforms the geology of the planet, that's interconnectedness. At the same time, we have epistemological interconnectedness with information technologies that is a new condition of knowledge for us. I explain what I mean. In order, for example, to model climate change properly, we have to use very expensive, complex supercomputers that actually produce emissions in order to model climate change. They have to intervene into the biosphere in order to measure the biosphere. This is a completely new, non-empirical, kind of simulated interventionist type of knowledge. And I think for us, it means that the ideal of human agency that the Enlightenment devised, right? An individual rational agent acting in the world, there's a causal relationship, point A to B, is completely disrupted both by technological evolution and by ecological changes. It just says we can't think in terms of human agency very easily anymore. And this is exactly why the question of what should we do is not an interesting question to start from in those times, because this do is very unclear when it comes to human agency with technologies and ecologies today.
Thank you. Yeah, that was actually taking part of a question I had about this notion of anthropocentrism, because that's the, let's say, the first criticism, like opposed to humans, that we started like watching, scaling, measuring everything out of our own perspective, and with the notion of Anthropocene, which has also been like widely criticized as being making the bad actor of the play in the title, let's say. What sense does this make? And so I wanted to ask you, how can we, with what is like this, thinking about this interconnectedness, as you said, Bogna, is this something that can get us out of this anthropocentric view, or is like trying to get out of this anthropocentric view already like an anthropocentric move?
I don't think we have to try to get out of anthropocentrism, because we are already radically displaced by the tools that we have created that have outgrown us. Like they arrived in our bodies as a xenomorph and like burst through our chest and are doing their own thing. Like the economy is almost starting to run on its own as an alien being that we are trying to grasp. So when we're thinking of, how can we become like less anthropocentric, for me, that's an ironic question at this point, where we are so radically displaced from our usual methods of knowing and being in the world. Maybe we just need to notice it more to actually desire being anthropocentric a bit more as a solution. That's up to everyone to decide how to react to this radical displacement.
Do one of you, Joanna and Kari, want to react to that?
I mean, I think this is one of the really interesting things that post-humanist thought has given us. Now, there is no such thing as post-humanist thought. There's a huge variety of of this form of thought. But I mean, I think one thing is this: it has injected into our discussions notions of hybridity, interconnectedness, which is what we're all talking about, ideas that we are constituted through our relations with other sentient beings. And the whole question of anthropocentrism, I think, in a sense, it's an old question that is not, I think, as relevant to today's society as it was in the past. I mean, anthropocentrism is the one thing that has sort of dogged all the debates about human rights and animal rights, and in a way that I think has been very negative for non-human animals. Just to take one example, that it requires a sort of defining of the animal by a lack. But I think that kind of debate, we've been doing that debate for what, 40 years. And I actually agree that it is time to sort of move on from it.
Good, thank you. Seems like we're agreeing on that one. I've another topic. I kind of, maybe for the last 3 minutes we have, 2 minutes we have, is the one concerning categories. So let's say that we have the category of the human, the non-human. Are these categories, or like the are these categories or classifications sometimes, or like most of the time, lead to simplifications and rationalizations? And I wanted to ask you, Joanna, is therefore like a categorization inherently violent and harmful, and do we need new categories or more fluent categories, as maybe proposed by Donna Haraway?
I mean, I think the fluidity of categories is really, really important. But also this whole idea of the crisis of categories that we keep hearing about, I think this is just a fantastic thing, because it's in the crisis of categories that we get creativity, we get eroticism, we get revolutions, whatever we can do. That is going to, I think, improve our societies in whatever ways we want. It does involve that kind of dismantling of the old categories that we've got. Throwing a bomb into that, the metaphorical bomb, I mean, into those established ways of thinking. And all of us can do that. However we are situated, whether we are writers or housewives or scientists or mechanics or whatever, that we have this possibility to disrupt the categories of our own disciplines, of our own worlds. And that's where creativity lies.
So you mean that with new categories, we can also open up like a new way of imagining things? Is that right? So having a crisis of category also means having a crisis of imagination, or like being in the process of reformulating it?
Yeah, and I think this notion of crisis, turning this notion of crisis in general into something that is positive is, firstly, it's a profoundly human activity. I mean, humanity was created when Eve went and plucked that apple from the tree of knowledge and disseminated it beautifully, causing humans to be cast out. This is where humanity is created in disobedience to the law, whether it's the law of God, or whether it's the law of institutions or capitalism or whatever. That is where humanity was born, and where there is power, there's always going to be resistance. And I think that is a real creative and something to be celebrated.
Thank you very much. We have now the time for questions from the Telegram chat. I will ask Julian to jump in.
Hi, everybody. I think you can already hear me.
Yeah.
If all is good, I think I will also be in the slide, but if not, then I can also continue from the off. Moritz, can I enter the scene? Okay, let's just start like this, and I will join you when I join you visually as well. And there was one question that came. Oh, that would help, wouldn't it? Okay, here we go. So there was one question that came up a few times, which was related to this question, or to this point that we need non-human tools to learn about non-human systems. And there was quite a bit of discussion around, aren't all these alternatives that you outlined, especially artificial intelligence, aren't there human-made tools? And like, what is the worth of that distinction there? What are you driving at? And I think related to that question, we can also package together with it, what other non-human tools might there be? Because several of you gestured to the existence of non-human tools, but there was interest in hearing more about that.
Oh yeah, I think I mean here non-human in a way that if you look at technology as a complex system, complexity simply means that the behaviors that emerge from the system are more than the sum of the behaviors that we put in. So there's an added emergent quality to any kind of complex technological system that was not pre-designed by the human creators. And we actually see that with the development of current prediction technologies, we see that we are heading towards having better prediction, but at a cost of understanding less as humans as to how predictions were exactly achieved. So this is called, the black box of machine learning models. So what we are actually going to see in the future with knowledge production is that at the cost of getting better predictions from complex data analysis, we're going to lose the quality of being completely able to understand how that prediction was achieved. So when I use non-human here, I don't necessarily mean, another species or a sentient machine, although I think that can also happen. I more gesture at non-humanist in how humanist models of knowing were presented before in intellectual paradigms.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that? This question has a long history, for me, canonically going back to the Macy conferences in the 1940s, first generation cybernetics, systems theory, then chaos theory, then complexity theory around complex dynamics and emergence and so on. So that question has been a front burner question for a long time. I think what happened in the sciences that short-circuited that genealogy, and one of the names for it is fascination with the genome as the book of life, was a kind of reductionist, an urge for reductionism in in interdisciplinary sciences that not only found its way into biology in terms of, the completely oversold bill of goods called the genome, but also with the pretension that complex systems were always already mathematizable and quantifiable and algorithmic. And I hope and think that we're at a point now in that conversation where we're beginning to see that that's not the case. I think this is what Bogna is gesturing toward. Not that you get rid of mathematics and physics or anything like that. It's just we now kind of realize how complex these systems are. So to try to stitch this together with what Joanna was talking about earlier, where we started, it's always been the case that what I call my thoughts, what I call my emotions, what I call my intentions. I mean, the lesson of post-structuralist philosophy generally, not just Derrida, but everybody, is that the conditions of possibility for any of those things are radically exterior to me and radically not human and radically not living. The name for that in Derrida is iterability or différance, but all these philosophers have a name for it. So that's always been true. We've known that since Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. The difference that Bogna is gesturing toward is not just an epistemological difference, it's a material difference, right? So and it's the acceleration of those material technological systems that has taken that epistemological truth and really radicalized it in terms of how it decenters the human. And I think that's a fundamental challenge for our political institutions right now that, and you see it with what's going on with social media, certainly in the United States, that I hope we can begin to address.
I mean, we can also say, are humans the authors of technologies, or are humans the vessels for the evolution of technology? When you as a human mammal make a baby, like a human baby, you're not saying I'm the author of this, right. Like I made it completely on my own. You're the vessel through which life carries itself out. Could it be the same with technologies, that humans are the vessels for the development of some kind of technological complexity?
Right. And at that point, as we were saying earlier, Joanna, you started off by saying at that point, you need a different philosophical vocabulary to describe what's going on.
I think there is another couple of questions which maybe fit here. There is like a question that basically goes into by Teresa, which basically asks, do we not have enough problems that are all too human, basically? Like, you know, are we ready for non-human interspecies collaboration when we're already, you know, struggling with incorporating our own kind? And I think related to that, you talk quite a bit about how institutions lag behind technological development. For me, these two questions relate in the sense of like, where do they bring us then in terms of directions?
We don't get to choose our own problems. Like, the problems don't ask you, like, are you ready right now to have a global pandemic? Of course, no one is ever ready. Philosophy is the art of saying everything is obvious when it's already too late. Of course, we already know that. The question is, how do you deal with things in the moment? We don't deserve or are ready for any problems that happen. So I don't think that's a correct way of phrasing the question, I guess.
Just as a footnote to that, we don't have a choice. You know, these things are all part of our lives anyway, and you know, we need to invent and reinvent and continually reinvent new ways and better ways of dealing with them. And we can't simply say it doesn't exist or that we don't have time right now to deal with it. These are things that are central to living in today's world.
Maybe still, I think the question remains like, what kind of political institutions would we need to adopt to the recent technological developments? Several of you pointed out that we were sort of outrun by these developments as a species, and therefore, you know, talking about non-humans gives us a perspective on where we might go from there. And I guess there's been work on how to incorporate the non-human into the political, and there's a few questions which touch on that.
Well, I'll just start. I mean, the shortest way to address that in terms of political institutions is to use the language and institutional structures that we have to broaden the sphere of inclusion in the demos. So the classic example is, you know, all of the movements you see in lots of different national assemblies to extend the basic paradigm of human rights to at least some non-human creatures, great apes typically, but doesn't need to stop there. And, you know, I would say that's fine as far as it goes. I'm all for it. I think great apes are people, non-Homo sapiens people. I think there's plenty of scientific evidence for that. Let's move on and have a different conversation. That doesn't mean that the paradigm of rights, and Joanna was gesturing to this, and I bet in the background thinking about Hannah Arendt as she was, that doesn't mean that the paradigm of rights that is kind of the coin of the realm in our current political institutions is the best way to think that problem. So, and this, I'm not, you know, just being sort of, you know, a sophist here. I mean, this involves really serious questions of, you know, philosophy of law. Is it, you know, what would legal structures look like if you evacuate categories like agency, intentionality, responsibility? Those are complex questions in terms of how the law functions. So, and that may be one of the reasons that the default mode is always to go back to what we already do and what we already know. But I think we're facing a situation now, and I do think social media is putting a lot of pressure on this question, especially of questions of regulation and questions of, you know, agency with regard to the dissemination of information in ways that are putting a lot of pressure on our existing paradigms. And I don't have a brilliant answer to what those new structures would look like, but I think a lot of people feel that they need to change and evolve.
I think with that call to change and evolve, we already have to draw to a close.
Of course.
So I don't know if any of you will join the conversation on Telegram after the call. I think Lena, you probably definitely will. And if any of you are available, that would be fantastic. Thank you, Joanna, Bogner, Kyrie, and Lena for this rich discussion, even though it was quite brief, of course. And Lena, I don't know if you have any closing words you want to give on.
Yeah, I also want to thank you. Thank you for the great questions from the chat. Thank you. Thanks to the audience, to the ZKM who hosting this. And then, of course, thank you, Bogner and Carrie and Joanna for engaging and forming this discussion with your thoughts and insights. They were really, really interesting. And I think we have a lot to take from this discussion to the next panels. Big thank you to Teresa and Sarah, who I was in constant communication with beforehand. And thank you, Clara, for supervising the kitchen state before we entered in the discussion here. And of course, the technical support team. Yeah, thank you. And I wish you a good afternoon in Germany and night in Shanghai and day in Houston and in Greece. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for me too for your more than human presence. And with that, we're almost at the end of the non-human session. If Moritz can make it happen, we will go right to the next program point, winding down with the film Nimia Citi, narrated by the artist and maker Jenna Sutela. And the work takes us right into what computer-mediated interspecies communication with bacteria and other beings might look like, speaking to many of the questions that we started to talk about in this session. Can we go to the film?